Hello, hi, I'm Sam. I'm head of collections at the Royal Logistic Corps Museum. I also sometimes go by head curator, depending on whether I'm speaking to people in our sector or the public who don't necessarily know what head of collections is. So we are just outside Winchester, and the museum is the museum for the Royal Logistic Corps, who, funnily enough, do the supply and transport capability of the British Army. They were only formed in 1993, so our earlier collections come from our five forming corps. So we have a very rich collection going back many hundreds of years, except I decided to do an exhibition that featured on nothing that we held with no personal stories that we already held because I like to make life challenging. So I'm going to talk about Rations for Two, which is a exhibition we put on between September 2024 and the September that we've just had, which focused on pregnancy and maternity and early motherhood in the British Army from both before there was maternity leave and now when there is maternity leave provisions. So that was a lovely little display of some of the uniforms that we had, just to give an insight. The aims of the exhibition were very simple. We wanted to engage new audiences, particularly those who felt that military museums weren't really for them. There probably are a few of you in the audience who think that a military museum isn't for you. You've got this image of like a military anorak or a soldier or a veteran who comes into military museums because they want to learn about war and guns and violence and stuff. And we have some of that. But we also have engaging stories for people outside of those audiences. And so we really wanted to try and bring in new audiences, but through a story that is still part of the British Army. It's an important part of certain soldiers' experiences, and that is pregnancy and maternity. So an underrepresented story of life in the British Army. So our scope was pregnancy, maternity, and early motherhood. As I said, both before the introduction of maternity leave in 1990. It was only in August 1990 that female soldiers in the British Army could have maternity leave and have right to work after they came back. We wanted to cover the legal fallout of there's a 12-year period where the MOD illegally dismissed pregnant women following an EU directive of 1978. So the 1975 Sexual Discrimination Act didn't apply to the British Army. There was an exemption in it, but an EU directive in 1978 said that was discrimination still, and it could not be part of it. But the UK decided that didn't apply to them, and legally it did. So in 1990, when they implemented maternity leave, they suddenly had 12 years worth of women who were illegally dismissed, and there were about up to 5,000 claims for payouts. We also wanted to show the development and evolution of maternity wear as our sort of physical material element that people could see, and run alongside that the personal stories of mothers who have served regardless of their cap badge. So whilst we are the Royal Logistic Corps Museum and the things that we will take into the permanent collection are RLC and Forming Corps, we opened this exhibition up to anyone serving in the British Army. We opened it up to anyone who'd been illegally dismissed, but unfortunately no one came forward. We spoke to people who had served in the early 90s when it was new and the Army was learning. We spoke to women who are serving now. I did open it up to partners who might want to discuss what being a military spouse was like, or particularly if they were civilian and their wife was serving. I wanted to hear about their perspective, but unfortunately no one came forward, which didn't really surprise me because the people who came forward were women who were really excited to tell their story for once in this area. And really interestingly, we had one veteran officer who came forward to talk about the 80s with a really great story about how a female soldier that he'd been working with, who was meant to be booted out the army, he stitched together, not him personally, but he got someone to stitch together two uniforms to make a big uniform for her. And then he hid her behind a desk until literally 2 days before she popped, and then she had to leave. So what did we already hold that could go in the exhibition? Literally nothing. Nothing that went in this exhibition was something we already had in the museum. So I was starting from complete scratch. So where did we start? We started with two streams. We had the object stream and we had the personal story stream. So we approached the National Army Museum for loans, and we did get a couple of them, which you'll see in a minute. We did buy uniforms on eBay, which did hold some gaps because we'd really hoped that the women that I interviewed would have their personal uniforms to be able to display alongside their personal stories. Some of them did, but in general, they tended to have handed them back. So we had to plug the gaps with some generic ones bought on eBay, but it still worked. To gather the personal stories, we tried the obvious route of plugging it out on social media, but that Didn't get any responses, zero responses. Our audience online don't tend to be serving females. They tended to be a lot of older male veterans, so they weren't really our target audience for this exhibition, for gathering intel. The places where our people came from were through existing networks and collaborations. So there was, through another meeting about something else on our military camp, I met a female captain who then gifted us her maternity dress and put a Facebook post up on the Sandhurst Sisterhood community group. So that got me some of the officer contingent for my exhibition. And then an existing male contact I had on camp, who I approached asking for ideas, he put me in touch with the chair of the Defence Breastfeeding Network, and she put it out on both her social media and to the network through the mailing list. And that's where I got three of the best personal stories and some of the multi-terrain pattern uniforms, so the most recent uniforms. And then I targeted individuals such as our new corps colonel, who's not so new, but was at the time, and then some names in the news. So there was a woman called Leanne Andrews who had been in her local newspaper telling her story from 20 years ago. And so I targeted her and got her story. So utilising existing networks was the main lesson I took from that. On its own, the museum had very little reach or influence with this particular community because we hadn't already built up that community. So finding the people who'd already done that work was invaluable. So these are some of the uniforms that we procured. The one top left, that lovely sort of tabard, that is unsurprisingly from 1995. It looks very 1990s. It was, I haven't actually found any photographic evidence of it actually being worn. That was a National Army Museum loan, as was the infamous fawn maternity smock, top right. Bottom left, that's the stretchy maternity dress that Captain Jade gave us. So that's now in our collection. The ones on the right are the more modern one. They were also gifts, but they weren't gifts from RLC people. So I had to sew on the RLC TRF on the corner there to make it look more like one of ours. So the people I interviewed 6 women still serving and 3 veterans. So the veterans were talking about having kids in the 90s, and obviously the serving women were talking about having them in the last 10 years, but mainly in the last 5 years. And there's a mixture of officers and other ranks there, and I very deliberately haven't done the military thing of putting them in rank order and everything. They're all in this slide. They're all a lovely higgledy-piggledy mishmash of wonderful women with wonderful stories. And what I found from talking to them, I didn't follow any specific. I didn't do an official oral history with them because this wasn't going in the archive, especially as most of them weren't RLC women. So 3 of them, Natasha Day, Abby Reimer, and Charlotte Butcher, I had the 3 of them in the museum with me and a cup of tea, and we had a group discussion for about 2 hours, and I made notes. Colonel Jacqueline Powell, bottom left corner, hers was a one-to-one interview because I had an hour of her time and I didn't realise that we were going to do the interview there and then, so I didn't really have anything but a pen and paper, so it wasn't an official oral history, but we just went with it. And then top right-hand corner, Lieutenant Colonel Samantha Dodge, she didn't, her and Jordan in the bottom middle, they wrote down their stories for me in their own words in an email, and then I sort of museum interpreted it up and then sent it back to them all so they could see. So the things that I got out of these women were very surprising. I had a lot of preconceptions going into this, not about what stories they would tell in their experiences, but what they'd be willing to tell me. And every woman who gave me their story didn't seem to be holding back. I fully expected a reticence. I worried that because they're all serving, I thought that they'd worry that this would impact their job and the things they were saying, especially as they knew this was going in an exhibition in a military museum, and especially the RLC ones knew it was going in a military museum exhibition at the home of the Corps, where the senior leadership of the Corps work and live. And this expectation was completely based on experience. In 2019, I did some oral histories of 3-6 Engineer Regiment for the RE Museum. The captain there had treated his interview like a post-op debrief to command. He'd been very, very anxious and he'd been very cautious about everything he said. but they weren't. These women were not. They talked about perceived prejudice by colleagues and line management. One woman told how she'd been told by someone senior to her that she should have kept her legs shut. That was in 2019. She'd her and her partner were engaged, not married. A heinous crime of not being married while having a child in 2019, and he'd been sent 6 hours away. She was still being based in this particular place. She'd asked if they could be posted together. That's all she'd asked, and she was told if it was a problem that they were going to be 6 hours apart, she should have kept her legs shut. There was also lots of, they felt they'd been judged for their postnatal bodies when they returned to work. There was lots of disgust from colleagues when milk was stored in the fridge. Some of the earlier women, in the 90s, we're talking about very, very personally about miscarriages. And then the serving ones were talking about inappropriate breastfeeding locations that they were given, such as an office with glass doors. They had pressure to return to work in peak soldier fitness. They would often talk about their families as well, like about gender role stereotypes, and how it wasn't just that sometimes their line management would assume that they'd be the primary caregiver, but their partners would. And then also what they'd seen improve over the last decade. And so all of these things, I thought they were such beautiful, personal and honest and vulnerable insights, knowing full well that they were going to be put up on these panels and that anyone who walked through the door could see them. There was also very little, actually, institutional concern from the army. The only one I did have was Sergeant Jordan Grace, who actually was the most positive of all the stories. Her story was this wonderful story about how she'd outgrown her normal uniform on the left there, and because a bigger size wouldn't be available in time, the Royal Military Police had let her wear the sports outfit on the other side so that she wasn't wearing civilian clothes. She still felt part of the team, but she was still comfortable. But then the Army comms team, through huge backwards and forwards, they tried to rewrite my panel. They turned it into a long article. I went back to them saying this isn't an appropriate panel. And then in the end, they said the only thing, they let me compromise on everything, but it had to say something about risk assessments. So we compromised and we put that on a caption. And the other thing I noticed was the really great support from senior leadership. So this is, as I said earlier, Colonel Jacqueline Powell. And I noticed from her three key things. She had institutional loyalty, she showed me vulnerability, and she was also willing to show self-reflection. And that very much, it summed up what I got from a lot of the women. When they were critical of either the army or themselves, they weren't seeing it as slagging anyone off. Every single thing they said, they tried to say in a way that was a critical observation. It was, this was my experience, and this is why it was bad. And from this, the British Army can learn to do this. So at no point did they view their criticisms as in any way that was going to affect their career, because it was all something that was very useful to people. It's probably worth noting in that element that the three women who were the most critical were part of the Defence Breastfeeding Network, and I feel that they had usually been showing people what the criticisms were in general to try and get things improved. So in summary, the main things I learned from this, that our social media reach should not extend to the audience we wanted. So to utilize existing networks and communities, that is the one single-handedly biggest thing that I got from this project. I also learned that donors and participants seemed far more forthcoming when there was a specific purpose. Our general contemporary collecting is very minimal. It's on the floor. Very few people come forward. But this was a specific call out with a specific purpose. And these women suddenly saw that their story was museum worthy. And I was very pleasantly surprised by how willing they were to be vulnerable, reflective, and critical of their employer, because they saw it as constructive. But the lack of things we were able to collect directly from the women, it did very much highlight the contemporary collecting crisis that military museums are in. Physical objects tend to get handed back to the military, and then documentation doesn't tend to get held on to because it's digital, and the army still have copies of it, but the people don't. Whereas sort of earlier pre-digital era, people would at least have copies of their own forms. And whilst most women were permitted to talk freely, there was one that required army vetting. And that shows that even within one institution, we had to be flexible with our approach and understanding of different requirements. Thank you very much.